Hello to all the comic fans, Marvel geeks, and all the nerds in between. Welcome to another episode of Vigilante Vibes, where we talk all things Marvel, along with other fandoms, but without the toxicity that's taken up way too much space in each and every fandom. I'm your host, Megan Nicole, and today I have a very special guest. He's a writer, he's a reader, he's a consulting theologian that I'm very excited to learn from today. Please welcome Michael Miller.
Oh, thank you very much, Megan. I'm super excited to be here, too.
I'm super excited to have you here. I've gone over a lot of your stuff, and it all has so much depth to it. And I'm really excited to learn from you today because, like I said to you before, I'm kind of new to everything you're doing. It's never been something I delved into, but I'm really excited to do it today.
Well, I'm pumped too, so that's cool. I appreciate your saying the depth to sort of the writing in that. For me, I did my undergrad. I was certified to teach social studies, and I got another degree in religious studies, which is basically like the history of a religion, right? Theology degrees are more like one path. Religious studies is talking about everything. And then I've, taught middle school religious ed. I worked as a youth minister. I taught high school religious studies for 13 years, and then I've just sort of pivoted out of the classroom to do the consulting theology work, which is basically like, it's a mix of one-on-one sort of coaching. Let's say you're comfortable in your gender and sexual identity, but maybe your parents think that it makes Jesus sad, and then I would sit down and say, hey, Jesus is actually cool with this. There might be some issue, and so sort of grounding in that really like justice-oriented message of Scripture. And this is all over the blog writing that I do, and when I taught, I've always loved teaching through pop culture, right? When I was in 10th grade, I had an English teacher, Kathy McCoy, who, when we were doing the hero's journey, we did King Arthur, we did the Odyssey, and then we watched Star Wars, right? The entire original trilogy. And 10th grade me was like, I get to watch Star Wars for school? Right? Like, that was it, right? There was nothing. I was like, I've peaked. Education can't get higher than that. But then she used it to outline the hero's journey, and that was my first introduction to what, like, George Lucas did with Joseph Campbell and all those other stories. And that's always stuck. And so for me, exploring pop culture in this way is a mix of my brain is always kind of running, right? So it likes to take things apart as I watch. And I also think it's just, it's more exciting, right? Like to sit down and say, like, let's take apart a story that you love and see what else might be in there, as opposed to just that superficial level.
I think that makes sense. I mean, what better way to connect with a broader and younger audience that is, no offense to the younger audience, but there is a bigger layer of superficial intrigue that you can really only connect with them on a deeper level with something that will catch their eye on that superficial level.
Yes. It's like it's always sort of been like an educational sneak attack, right? Like, hey, we're watching a movie today, and so that's fun. And then you don't even realize you're doing the analysis until afterwards. And I do that a lot with my writing too, right? Like, there will be that sort of the setup for the piece is like somebody's interested in looking a little closer at this pop culture thing, but then it shifts into sort of like some personal self-disclosure or sort of a thought experiment or something like that. It levels that sort of contemplative playing field, right? Because we're all talking about the same movie or the same comic or whatever.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Have you found that there's a certain fandom that you are able to make that connection with the most with your audience?
That's a really interesting question. See, that's why you're the host and you have the cool headphones and like the mic and all that, which I'm, to be honest, a little low-key jealous of, but I've made my own life choices.
The headphones glitch out probably every time, so if we accidentally switch to my computer's setting, just know that they stopped working for the day.
Well,
Don't worry.
They look very cool.
Thank you.
What's interesting is when I started teaching, I was able to just do like general pop culture classes, right? Where we would pull from music, a couple movies, a couple TV shows, maybe some contemporary novels. But over that decade plus in the classroom, with the rise of streaming services and just like this huge proliferation of fandoms, it became a lot harder to design a term around like 6 to 8 things that you know everybody's going to be mildly familiar with. Like our music choices aren't as the Billboard Top 100 isn't what it used to be, right? Like the movies and shows that you're loving depends a lot on what your streaming services you have, right? And when you, it's not so much. I mean, it's been years since. Hey, did you see this last night? It's like, what point are you at? Are you watching this? Like, are you caught up? Like, where? And so I have done courses around Star Wars. I have done courses around Doctor Who. I've done the biggest one by far, though, is I did a course on comic books and comic book movies as like an avenue to discuss social justice. I called it Marvelous Justice, and I was very proud of the pun. Thank you. It wasn't really stretching though, but it had brand recognition there, and that was easily the most popular thing that I ever taught. Because as I move through that course, right, like every year you have kids who grew up with that, right? Like all those students that I had, this has always been a part of their life, which is one of the things that I really love about you, right? Like this idea of this positivity and this cutting out this toxicity, because I think all the time when I was a kid, like my first comic book was Web of Spider-Man number 12, and I got it like I was 3 years old off the spinny rack at the grocery store, right? I couldn't even read it at 3, but like all the pages had fallen out, the binding was curled, and like I read that so many times. And I remember when I was 7, for Christmas, I got this membership to like our local comic book store, so like I would have my pull list and little 7-year-old me would go in. And I read regularly until I turned 16. And then, like, money for comics was vying for money with gas and going out to the movies and all those things that come with a driver's license. But the other part of that was there was this sense of insecurity around how much I loved comic books at that time, right? So we're talking, like, the late 90s, early 2000s. And so my graduating class in high school was 570 kids. I did not know another single person who read comics.
Aww.
No, of course there were. I mean, how the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but nobody talked about it, right? And so it was just something that I would talk about, like, with my family and cousins and, like, people who I knew who shared that. But it just, like, elementary school was exciting, and somewhere through that awkward, like, 5th to 9th grade, like, sort of transition, there was just something intuitively where I was like, I probably shouldn't talk about that out loud anymore, right? Because there was, heaven forbid, right, as a middle schooler, that you're uncool, right? Like, that hangs over your adolescence and your teenage years, and then you grow up and realize cool's boring anyway, and you're just you. But so now to be in this age where it is everywhere, right? Every one of those students that I taught during those 13 years could name a favorite Avenger, even if they've never seen the movies.
Yeah.
Right? And so I am always fascinated and saddened by that toxicity. Back to why I love what you do, right? Because I will see the sniping online and the Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram posts, whatever, the TikToks, the YouTube videos, the podcasts, and this sort of like attacking writers or artists or segments of fandoms. And I am just old enough to remember when that nerdiness was solidarity, right? Like as a kid, when that 10th grade teacher showed us Star Wars, and one of my friends who was sitting at my table also loved it, I was like, oh my God, this is a safe space here, right? Like this nerdy part can come out. And so it's so frustrating and so sad to see that negativity, because I'm like, Jesus, like 20 years ago, you're not saying that out loud, right? That's not something, or at least I wasn't comfortable owning that. And so I love, love, love your mission and the way you do this, because I think that's so important. Like, how quickly we as a culture have forgotten now that it's popular, right? Like, now that this stuff is cool, now that everybody loves Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans and Scarlett Johansson, we've just forgotten, and kids are growing up without that, right? So what was a generation ago, like, this tight little nerdy solidarity, and of course we would argue about whether Nightcrawler was cooler than Gambit, right? Or whether Return of the Jedi or The Empire Strikes Back was the better Star Wars sequel. But, like, it was fun debate, right? Like, that sort of, as opposed, so I love that you do that here, because that's something that I would talk in that Marvel class with the kids, because there would be kids who would show up because they loved it, kids who were interested because they didn't know much about it, and kids who were like, this is a movie class, so I'm gonna take it, right? Because it's better than something else. But they're stunned by that, right? Like, when I tell them, I'm like, this is cool. Like, when Robert Downey Jr. announces himself as Iron Man in that great scene at the end of the original one, right, where Tony Stark just comes out and says that he is. Like, that, I retrospectively, I've come to look at that as this watershed moment in nerd fandoms. Yeah. Tony Stark owns it, right? He is Iron Man. And all of a sudden, between that and The Dark Knight coming out that summer, too, and then The Big Bang Theory making it part of, like all of a sudden people were just talking about that. Like, it was cool. Like, we could own that as well. And so I think those Marvel movies, as a result of that placement, I think that's why the kids responded to it as well as they did, right? Because it was something that they already loved.
I 100% understand what you mean, because I was in the same situation as a kid. X-Men, the anime series, got me started so early, and no one was willing to admit they liked the X-Men, or they read the comics, or they were interested in any of this stuff. So you do keep it to yourself. And then when you do find a safe space, you have outsiders say, like, ugh, nerds, and just kind of like yelling at you from all ways. And I always looked at my podcast as something that I would have wanted as a child, as a kid. I would want to hear. I'd want that safe space to know, like, you can like this. It's okay. And also, you can just be getting into the fandom, and that's okay. You can never have read a comic book in your life. That is okay. Gatekeeping is what's killing the fandoms.
Yes.
This toxicity. And I really love that you're providing a space that says, even if you have the slightest bit of interest in this fandom, you're welcome, because it's an open fandom. It should be. And I think we need so much more of that. So I love what you do. I love that you're giving that safe space to other people, because the world is in such... We need more safe spaces.
Yes.
We're in such short supply of them.
I was reading last week, I think there was this piece in The Atlantic with this woman, Dr. Alice Evans, who is being interviewed, and she is a senior lecturer at King's College London, and her specialty is researching the root causes of gender inequality in the world, right? And so that's what the bulk of the piece was about. But the one part that I was thinking about in regards to this conversation was she was discussing social media, right, alongside the contact hypothesis, right? This idea that the way to build empathy and connection is to be around people who are different from you, right? Because then you realize they aren't different. And so they were discussing why social media isn't an avenue for that. Because in theory, right, like, so many different people, so many different opinions. And she made the point, which just fascinated me, that your average TikTok video, your average YouTube video, your average Instagram reel are not long enough for the contact hypothesis to work, right? So you're getting this snippet of somebody who is different than you. And if it already aligns with what you believe, then you go all in. If it doesn't, then it's just sort of white noise. And so it was this really interesting and I think important reflection on, back to that issue of gatekeeping, right? Because in theory, you should be able to look and see, like, go to the internet and say, here are all these people who love it and all these people who don't, but we all kind of love comics, so there we are. But it's not, as opposed to, like, again, as a kid on the playground talking about X-Men the animated series and debating, right, you know, that difference between being young enough to, like, you're pretending to be the X-Men on the playground, to then what you said a moment ago about, I don't even know that I could, who's going to own this, right? That they enjoy it, let alone that they then go to get the comics as well. There you're having those conversations with people that you see every day, right? It creates that empathy. And we don't have social media doesn't provide the mechanism for that. And I'm not saying it's, social media is all the devil and it needs to be burned to the ground. I have enough social media accounts, so that would be a hypocritical statement to make. But I think it's something that we have to think about too, especially like you said, in regard to that gatekeeping. I remember Stan Lee, they said for years this was like hung on the wall in the offices of Marvel in New York. His maxim was, every comic is somebody's first comic. And so the idea that any issue should be absolutely accessible to anyone who picks it up, right? And if it isn't, it's not the fault of the reader for not knowing the whole story. It's the fault of the author and the artist and the editor for not making it accessible. And whenever I see those gatekeeping fights playing out, that's what I think of. I'm like, the point is that everybody should be welcome. Like Stan Lee himself is like, that's the goal, right? Like but we miss that, and it's so sad.
I 100% agree. It should be accessible because, we talk all day about kids need to read more. Kids need to be able to express themselves and broaden their horizons, but then some kids don't even have a comic store around. I don't have one for about an hour away. So it's like two things. I think comics shouldn't be sold outside of comic stores as well. But also, kids should be more comfortable in asking questions to other people. It goes back to that toxicity. If I read the latest Spider-Man, but I'm not able to afford the other ones, I should be able to ask someone what happens without someone saying, go read it for yourself. Google's right there. Do this. There is this weird standoffness to the fandom with a new fan. And it's really sad because at one point we were all nerds that did not tell anyone about it. Like you said, we kept it to ourselves. We were quiet. We were on the DL. And now we're all so loud about what we love. We're wearing the t-shirts, we have the tattoos, we have our social media handles mention our favorite ones, our favorite heroes, but we're more distant than ever with each other.
Yes. And that accessibility should be part of it. And I think that's something that I think about a lot too when and I've never found any hard data on this, but I wish there was. Because when we look at our shift from the video rental store, right, like in neighborhoods and things like that, to streaming, that has to disproportionately affect people in lower socioeconomic standings, right? Because you need the internet capabilities, you need access, you need a monthly subscription fee, as opposed to just walking down to the video store where you didn't even pay to be a member, and anywhere from $1 to $5 to rent the video for the week, right? Like, so you see that so much new video content is locked behind a paywall. And like you said, with comics, they're just not accessible. I fell in love with them because they were on the spinny rack at the gas station or at the grocery store. Like, there is a little mini mart up the street from my parents that my brother and I would walk up, and because everything was between like $1.50 and like, $2 something if it had like a foil 90s cover, then you could pick that up. And that fear of not knowing, like you said, that fear of asking, that fear of that's so hard. Right? I remember nobody ever, like, I didn't learn this in my education classes, which is probably something that should have been covered, but I remembered how freeing it was the first time a student asked me a question, and I looked at him and I said, I have no idea. I'm like, that's a great question. Like, we were talking about religious studies, like, this tradition is thousands of years old. I don't know. I have never read that. I've never even thought that, but it's amazing, and I love that you did that, and I can figure it out, right? And we can talk more about it next time. And it was it was born of just instinct in that moment, where I'm like, I could lie and be really convincing because I'm good at what I do, or I could just be honest. And then that became something that over the years, that I took pride on modeling for the kids, right? Like, to just say, I don't know. But you're right. Like, we are scared of how we're viewed. We're scared of, and what's funny is all those years teaching pop culture, what I learned is without fail, the most interesting observations came from the kids who had never seen it before.
Oh.
Because they didn't know what they were supposed to say.
Okay.
Right? So, like, in the Star Wars class, I remember this one year we were watching The Empire Strikes Back, and this student who had never seen any of the movies was like, that was my favorite because it was the funniest. And any Star Wars fan is like, whoa, whoa, whoa. No, that's the dark, arty one. Thank you very much. But then she talked about, like, R2-D2 and 3PO's bickering and, like, sort of Han sarcasm. And I saw, for the first time, really, legitimately how funny it was, right? Or this student raised the point once in Revenge of the Sith, like, after Anakin has, like, that dark moment where he becomes Vader and he murders all the kids in the temple. And they were like, that's kind of screwed up that he did that, like, a week or two after realizing he's a father. And it's like, never thought of that. Thank you for... And so you would see that with the Marvel movies. I would see that in the Doctor Who class, right? Like, these kids who had no preconceived notion of what was right or wrong or cool or uncool in the fandom were free. So they would go to these really insightful places, and once they got comfortable asking that question. And so that's it. For me, the gatekeeping isn't just sad for the people who are forced out by people who won't answer those questions and feel a little snobbish about it. But what fans are losing by not engaging in those conversations with new people is really problematic too, because we're missing out on insights that we would never glean otherwise.
That is so true, and I never thought about it till now, but my husband, he is not even one bit into anything nerdy. Heroes, comics, doesn't care, but he does show up for every movie with me, and he holds the snacks, and that's all I ask. But we recently watched all of the Guardians of the Galaxy, because I was like, you know what, that's just weird enough, might as well throw them in.
Yes.
And at the end of it, he was like, I think Star-Lord might be my favorite because he has no character development, but everyone around him has more character development, and he stays the same, so it looks like he has changed. And I sat there and I was like, I'll be damned. Wait, hang on. And it kind of like shook the nerd in me, because I was like, that's just not what you say. And now
Yes.
you say that, I'm like, that's exactly what happened. And I remember telling him, like, how could you say something so big but so true? And he's like, I guess I just see it differently. I don't know. I didn't read the comics. I didn't do all of that. And I was like, that's fair, but, like, you kind of shook me to my core there. So I totally get what you're saying. We should be more open to these kind of different takes, hot takes, some would call it.
Yeah.
Because it helps us see a different perspective.
Absolutely. And that's the only way it grows, right? Like, the idea of the fandoms growing, the stories continuing. Like, I would say all the time, I would, in the comic book class, right, we would watch a lot of films, but then we would read several trade collections, right? Like, I had enough that I could let the kids vote, so they were a little more invested in what they were reading. And it would always interest me, because I think, you know, the big two, right, Marvel and DC, publish mainly for people like us, adult comic fans, right? Like, what we're going to go out and read, because we have disposable income. Yay. But practically, if they want to be publishing for another 50 years, they need to, what are kids interested in reading, right? And what blew my mind is, for as popular as the MCU was, the kids never wanted to read about Thor or about Captain America or about Iron Man. The characters that they loved were Kamala Khan, right, as Ms. Marvel. Like, they loved Kamala. They love Spider-Man, but when they want to read Spider-Man, they're talking about Miles Morales, right? Riri Williams, Ironheart, we had these great conversations with her. And so these young teenage heroes, understandably, the young kids are connecting to, right? Because that's just a different experience. And so I would always, like, I think of that when I go to pick up my file every week at my my comic shop, because I luckily we still have one in town. We had sadly another one that closed a couple years ago, but we still have one that's but they do a lot of gaming and a lot of used books and things like that too, right? It's not just like the sort of comic thing drives it. But and I think about like the regular monthly titles, and Miles is always out there, which is awesome. But all these other heroes that I would see my kids, like, they would ask, like, how cool is that in class when they're like, this didn't end. And I'm like, welcome to Serial Comics. They never end because they want you to get the next one. And then they would ask where they could get it, right? They're like, okay, so where can I find this? And so I think that is part of it too, right? Like in this welcoming of new fans, there's also where does that spotlight land? Sometimes on the classic heroes, but also some of these other ones who have the potential to be that next generation of them.
Yeah, it's always the classic heroes. You won't find a new run of a newer character or their first run without there being a name drop of some sort. Like the newest one, Cohorty, from the What If series of Marvel Studios. She got her own first one-off of a comic because she originally started as an MCU character. But throughout the comic, she was meeting the heavy hitters of the Marvel Comics world, like Echo, Daredevil, Loki. And I was like, I get why they do it. Because you can't just introduce a new character and expect people to be like, I love her. You do have to kind of give the readers that safe comfort feeling like, okay, I don't know her, but I do know that guy. I do know that character. So it's kind of like you don't want to show up to a party by yourself. You have to go with a friend.
Oh, I love that analogy. And it makes me think of little kid me when we would be in the grocery store. Actually, the first issue of the Fantastic Four I ever read, it was the Fantastic Four versus the new Fantastic Four. So I didn't, like, I knew who the Fantastic Four were, but I didn't really know them as characters. But they were facing off on the cover against Spider-Man, against Hulk, against Wolverine, and against Ghost Rider. And, well, Ghost Rider I probably knew the less. He was a flaming skull who rode a motorcycle. You've sold me, right? Like, there was nothing else young me needed. So I picked that up, and the Fantastic Four went on to become second, like, they were tied with the X-Men for the first place in my heart, right? Like, they were second to none. But like you said, it was because, I love that analogy of not going to the party on your own. That's really cool. Because it was, I'm like, oh, I know all these other people, and maybe this is a reason to check out the Fantastic Four, too.
Yeah, exactly. There's been, I mean, when I was younger, that's kind of how I started, was I knew some characters in the comics, and I was like, oh, but they kind of look different from the animated shows and what I know. So the first comic run I ever finished was Mr. and Mrs. X by Kelly Thompson, because it was Rogue and Gambit. That's where I started. I was like, comfort characters. I know you guys.
Yeah.
We're in this together now. And that's where it started, and it has not stopped. And I owe all of that to the X-Men.
Yeah. I think that the X-Men were, especially for a certain age, right, of comic fan, they were like the gateway in, right? I remember, like you, I met the X-Men first through the animated series, and then that Christmas when my parents got me the membership to that comic club, I also got, like, my uncle also this little like comic starter kit, right? Comic collecting starter kit. And it was a lot of like those random just one-off issues that you find if you're in Ollie's or something like that, and like, oh, here's the big bag of discount comics. And so I was flipping through it, and there was a copy of that X-Men #1 with like the Jim Lee art, and you see like Wolverine and Cyclops, and like you said, they look different because they were rippling in the height of their 90s like musculature. But I was so excited because I'm like, oh my gosh, they're from the show, right? That I build my Saturday morning around. And so that was exciting. And again, like you said, as far as that accessibility, that was still back in the time where they weren't terribly expensive, right? Like, so as a kid, I could be like, all right, I'm gonna mow a couple extra lawns this week, and that's gonna net me like 4 or 5 other books, right? Like, this is what we can do here. And so that that brought that in, right? But again, there was the accessibility, and I know everything costs more, and that makes me sound like I'm 1,000 years old to be like, when I was a kid, You could get that for a nickel. But really, like, the fact that comics are so much more expensive and that they aren't, like you said, out everywhere, even in bookstores or something like that, right? It makes it harder for people who want to jump in to do that.
Yeah, the bookstores around me, they have the old comics that still are not a dollar, $1.50. They're still holding steady to that $3.99 price,
Yeah.
which is like, okay, I guess that's between you and God, but whatever. But yeah, it's hard to jump in where you want. But I think they're doing a good job lately of kind of keeping in new characters and the old ones you love, but also going to a younger audience, like Spidey and His Amazing Friends on
Yes.
Disney Plus. They have their own comic now, which is that's pretty amazing because I that means this year I can go take my daughter to New Comic Book Day and get her one of those and see what she thinks of it.
That makes me so happy. And I think that that accessibility for little kids is something that I think about all
Yeah.
the time. My, like, when I think of my friends with kids and I think of the number of comics I can give them, right, to say, hey, you should check this out, it's not what it was. And there's this debate within the fandom. And granted, like, if you go back to the, to the 80s, right, you see your Dark Knight Rises, right, or your Watchmen or your things like that. And so, but by and large, when I was a kid, I could sort of pick up anything and enjoy it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, and this is totally me just doing from the gut armchair psychoanalyzing and speaking in admittedly unfair generalities, I think there are a lot of adult fans who still carry that insecurity of their youth, right? And so they want the story to be for them, right? Like they want the emotional heaviness, they want the sexuality, they want the... I remember a friend of mine was at our local comic shop with her kids, and they had some free Batman comics left over from Batman Day, right, that they had given, and so her little son was flipping through, and he's like, Mom, I don't know if this is for kids, like this guy's head just got... I think that guy's head just got cut off. And so, like, I looked, none of actually the Batman comics they gave out were okay for kids, right? Like, that Joker Batman deadly duo where first issue where they were looking for Harley Quinn was the most, like, kid appropriate one, and that was a far cry from that. But it's just sad because that is, again, that's how you make new fans. And I love that. Like, I mean, the whole, the analyzing and breaking down comics the way that I do, writing about them, teaching about them, it's because I believe at the core of these stories, there's more. Right? Not all of them, but there is. And I think that's why what I loved as a kid, the parts that I'm still enjoying now, it's because of that. Right? Because I now find there's this extra depth. I can understand it speaking on a different level. But I would never deny that base level, right? Like, because I think that's important, and I think it's okay to love stories that are accessible to kids. And I really think, and people roll their eyes when I say this, I think comic book movies are popular for the exact same reason Hallmark Christmas movies are. And it's because our world is dark and it is heavy, and it becomes... the news is like, I watch it only if I'm going to therapy later that day, right? Like, it's a lot
Yeah.
to carry. And so, when you turn on a Hallmark Christmas movie, you know that the woman with the high-paying city job who's returned to her home to help her parents with their bake sale or to run the Christmas fair because her plane got stranded is going to fall for the guy who is her best friend or ex, who has just enough beard scruff to be attractive but not too threatening. And that's reassuring, right? You know they're going to kiss, and maybe Santa will be there, and it's nourishing. And superhero movies are the same thing. We know the good guy will win in the end. Heroes triumph. Light overcomes the darkness. And it doesn't feel that way a lot, right? Like, and back to, like, the social media doom scrolling, I mean, anytime we sign into any device, there's so much of that. so much overpowering, so much. And so, again, they attract different audiences, though I'm sure there's overlap if we were to draw a Venn diagram, right? But I think people love superhero movies or comics or the cartoon superhero media in general because it is reassuring to know that no matter what trial they go through, it's going to be okay in the end. We might lose some characters, right? Tony might sacrifice himself. Natasha might sacrifice himself. Steve might travel in time and come back as Joe Biden. But that's like... That's still it's a heroic death, right? Like it's a heroic, like we cry our eyes out, but we still feel good. Good has triumphed, and so I think we need that. And I think the box office and the streaming success that they are speaks to that. I think it's something that we crave.
Yes, I do think I do agree. There is a level of comfort when you see the characters you've grown up with fighting these battles that you don't have to be involved with. That are like, they're saving the world, the galaxy, and it does make your problems look a little smaller than compared. So it's a good way to disassociate with your life, throw yourself into it. And I think the comics are really good for that too. With Marvel, like the MCU, I think the biggest thing is that there's something for everyone. Like, you aren't an Iron Man fan, great, there's Thor. Yeah. And you can find yourself in somewhere and find some kind of comfort within the MCU.
That, and I think I remember in those early movies, right, watching that audience grow, right? Like, when I went to see Iron Man in '08, it was mostly... Like, you had people who loved Robert Downey Jr., people who were intrigued by the character, but the bulk of those people in that first weekend seemed like, hey, I loved this as a kid, and I'm interested to see how this works. But yeah, that fact that there is so much, right? Like you said, there are all these different characters to identify with. There's all these different characters that you can connect with, right? It creates this huge space to be seen. It creates this space to be entertained. It creates the space to be reassured. And there's so many different options, right? Because you don't have to like all of it. You probably won't. And you just find that little place that feels like home.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think we need more of those spaces that we can find that kind of comfort in, ones that we can get familiar with the characters and their personalities and their lives and their problems, where we can just go in, turn off our brain, don't think about what's outside of the theater, and just find a happy space for us. Because you're right, the world is scary. A lot is going on, something different every single day, and we're all just holding on and surviving until the next problem.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. And some days it feels like you're holding on in that sort of like cartoon character way, where like your nails are digging out grooves, right? Like on the floor as you're trying to like just stay connected. And I would presume that's part of the enduring appeal for these characters, right? Like, is the sense that you know, I mean, decades and decades. I mean, Superman's been, what, 80-some years, right? That's this sense of, you know, being able to find that reassurance that good will win in the end, and to have that bit of escapism is, I think, is really helpful.
Yeah. I think so. I think it's like with Captain America Brave New World. I'm very excited for the movie, but we know it'll be a political thriller type of thing.
Yes.
And I'm very worried that people will start to compare it to certain political candidates, political issues that'll make it break that comforting zone, that safe space where you can disassociate. And you'll go in there with thinking, oh, that's supposed to be that guy. That's a jab at that guy. And that's what I'm worried about.
Yeah.
And I can see it happening. It's kind of a rough time to drop that movie, but at the same time, we want to see it.
Yeah.
So I think if we just kept that kind of border up, like, okay, I know things are politically scary right now, but you can go into this movie and not think about that. We could just stay in our comfort zone, be comfortable in it, and be happy.
Yeah. I think too that sense of, and I like the way that you frame that as far as like that reflection being scary, because I think that's part of it too, right? Like we again, to speak in unfair generalities, I think we as a culture have been increasingly losing our ability to process nuance, right? So I mean, if you look at just to use Star Wars as a direct example, right? George Lucas has said multiple times, right? The film was in large part in commentary with the Vietnam War, right? The rebellion were meant to be the Viet Cong. The Empire was the United States, and he was talking about U.S. imperial actions. I didn't know that when I watched it as a kid, right? Like, my main concern was whether it was C3PO or BO, because sometimes it sounded like, I can't imagine it's body odor, but sometimes it sounded like that was like what little kid me was concerned with, or what exactly the Force could do superpower-wise. But so we have these stories with this extra level of commentary, but the point is always, or almost always, I guess not all artists do this, to invite that reflection, right? What does it make you feel? What does it make you think? And I don't think we are good with nuance. I don't think we're good with sort of sitting in the quiet. I don't think we're, because that is, and in part I think because, like you said, so much of our world is so overwhelming, just that contemplative part feels triggering, right? Like, it's, how do we even sit and parse this? Like, I remember when Nick Spencer was writing Captain America, and he did that run with, you know, Sam Wilson was Cap at the time, and he leaned into the not my Captain America, and all of it was I will bet it will become historically one of the great Cap runs, right? Because it was doing what Cap comics always do. But in the moment, it was 2015 and 2016, right? And so you have the language that we saw around Trump's first campaign, and then him taking office, and it was impossible for readers to be in that space, right, without it feeling overwhelming. And I think that's why it was as sort of controversial run as it was, because just what you're saying, right? Like, when the rest of the world feels so overwhelming, and we're not good with sitting with ambiguity and nuance and reflecting, it makes stories like that more pointed. And I think you're right. I am already sort of envisioning the number of think pieces and the number of think pieces that will follow Brave New World, really having nothing to do with this story. And it's because I've been waiting for Anthony Mackie since the end of Endgame. I'm like, yes, I love him as an actor. I love the idea of Sam becoming Captain America. I love the visual of the wings. I love the idea of you know, not just a black man wearing the flag in that way, but also a man who doesn't have superpowers, right? Like, this idea that Captain America, like the symbol of liberty, the symbol of freedom, is a man who doesn't have all those things. And so I was like, yes. And now you're right. Like, I'm like, okay, well, it's in February, released to begin with. I don't know what I'm supposed to say about that. And then we, you know, following the election and the political climate in the country, I'm like, I don't know. Maybe I need to just do like a no screens vacation for that, you know, the weeks around that release, because that I'm so excited, and I think it'll be such a good movie. But I think you're right. It's going to be hard to, if not impossible, to separate the online commentary from all of that.
Yeah, and I think anyone that wants to have that disruption of fantasy and reality will find it in any movie, like Superman, Fantastic Four, Thunderbolts. I can see that there's going to be a lot of discourse around that, and it's like, I guess it might as well happen.
and I think about this, and I don't know your thoughts here, but for me, I think part of it, what frustrates me is less the discourse, right, than how the discourse happens, right? It's this idea that we are existing in this world of absolutes, right? And we are so certain that our opinion is right, and we are so certain that we have seen everything, that we understand everything. And there is such moral superiority on the right as well as the left, right? Like, we often will excuse our own side, but there is this sense of like this antagonism, and this sense of this arrogance, and this sense of this ego. Back to what you said about new fans coming in, you know, before. We're not comfortable saying, I don't know. right? Like, what do we, and that, so I think the discourse for me has become problematic because we generally as a culture don't know how to have that. We don't know how to acknowledge the difference in human beings, right? Like that we are all so many things, right? Like we have, depending on, our, what parts are blended and where we are in any moment, the day that we had like we are so many different things, and we don't acknowledge that in ourselves, and we absolutely refuse to acknowledge that in other people. And I think that makes it all but impossible, right? As opposed to saying, oh, this is really cool. Like, what do you think this is about? Oh, I saw this. Did you see that? It becomes like this trauma-inducing, like, wound-triggering experience.
I agree with everything you said. It's it's very hard. It's hard separating the art from what's going on in life, and I think the discourse is it's going to happen either way, but I think the worst part of it is tainting the eyes of people who haven't seen it yet.
Yeah.
So they go into the movie and say, that's the part they're talking about. That's what they mean. That's the hidden message. And it's like, just shut up. Just shut up. Let people live. Let people enjoy. There's movies that, yeah, they have a hidden message. I just ignore the message. I just like it. Like, I think that's totally fine. And I think more people should look into that because, like I've said so many times, it's a safe space. It's just a place where you can get out of your life and just put yourself in another universe. And you should enjoy that because we all need it at this time in life.
Yeah. And it's funny, like you said, going in with already that awareness. As somebody with an anxiety disorder, like, there's always a show that I'm watching, but I read ages ago that people with anxiety like to rewatch shows and movies as opposed to going to new ones because you know what's coming. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's me. So there has never been a time since I started watching the show that I'm not watching Doctor Who, right? Like, some doctors say, like, there's always one or the other. And then I'll cycle through, like, some TV favorite, like Gilmore Girls is there, Scrubs, The Office, right, King of Queens, whatever, things like that. But so the other day I was like, clearly being wild and crazy and reckless, I just opened Disney Plus and I was like, all right, so let's watch something. But I was still drawn to something familiar. And I'm like, I haven't seen The Simpsons probably since I was in high school, right? So I just picked a random season and watched a couple episodes. And the one episode was where Homer's telling the kids about how he met Marge, and he's talking about going out on a date, and they're walking out of The Empire Strikes Back. Like, and you see it's opening weekend, you see the line, and Homer's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father, right? And everyone's like, oh, come on, and like the crowd is booing him. And what I found fascinating about that, and why I thought of it with what you just said, was that the reason that scene was funny was only somebody as stupid and ignorant as Homer Simpson would spoil the end of a movie that just came out. Now, if you're not there opening night, social media, articles, everything is filled with pieces overtly discussing the end. So like you said, you're already going in. Hell, if you see it that Saturday as opposed to Thursday or Friday night, let alone in the weeks to follow, you've already seen TikToks and you've already heard podcasts and YouTube breakdowns and articles about, like, well, this stands for this. And so you can't even go into the plot free, let alone this sense of, what do you think it might mean? And that to me, right, the heart of why I like to talk about this stuff, why I like to write about this, why I like to teach with it, is I am always fascinated by what someone else sees. Right? Because I would tell my students all the time, I'm like, listen, you are going to be scared to raise your hand because you think you're going to be wrong. But here's the deal, right? You can't be wrong when I'm asking you your opinion. What do you think this means? Right? What struck you? What made you happy? What made you sad? What made you think? What did you think about? And I will argue, and I'm sure there are many far more educated than I literature professors and film studies professors who would be like, I don't know about this. But I would argue that authorial intent is always a distant second at best. right? Yes, it's fascinating to know what the author was trying to say. But especially when we're talking about pop culture, it is only relevant, it's only popular because how it affects us. Mm-hmm. Right? So Taylor Swift, we have never seen anything like Taylor Swift. Love her, hate her, or indifferent. They're in the history of music, right? There has never been anybody with a creative output and the critical acclaim and the tour sales and all of that. And yes, we're all interested in what guy she was writing whatever song about, but the reason it's popular is because what we feel with that music, right? The reason we love the TV shows that we do, the movies that we do, it's because of what they make us feel, right? And I remember reading an interview years ago with Bono, and he was talking about the song One. And he said, you know, it's become this great anthem for social justice, but he's like, I wrote it as a breakup song because the Edge and his wife were getting a divorce at the time. And he's like, so I wrote a breakup song, and I've had people come to me, couples, and say, it's the most beautiful thing they ever heard, and it was their first dance at their wedding. And he's like, and I would always think, you know, isn't that beautiful about music, right? He's like, I wrote a breakup song, but this couple feels their love and their unity there. And that's why I love this stuff, right? Like, that's why I love talking about this stuff. That's why I love writing about it. And that's why I loved using it in the classroom, right? This question about what do you see? Because you're the only one who can answer that, right? Like, that's what I would always tell my kids. I'm like, listen, we can talk about the other, like, but what do you see? That's it, right? Like, that is uniquely yours. When I write, when I do my sort of analyses, when I break up, so often there's self-disclosure in there. Because at the end of the day, I was writing a piece about Casablanca the other day. A bazillion things had been written about Casablanca, right? Like, how do you say something new? You can't. But I could talk about what I felt. Because nobody else can say that except me, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's why I love this. And back to your point about safe spaces, that's why I think that safe space is important to give people a place to be, to feel. And they certainly don't need to be going into new movies and things like that with all this other stuff already dumped on them.
I don't have anything to add to that. You basically covered everything. My gosh, I see how you are able to talk about this for so long because you just keep giving so many amazing things to add to it. I love everything you've said. You have such a good head on your shoulders, and I think you're making such a difference in the nerd world and anyone else involved who just needs someone like you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That means a lot, Megan. Thank you.
Of course. So as we wrap up, would you mind telling our listeners where they can find you?
All right. If you would, mycomicrelief.wordpress.com is my blog, so they can hear just the free association rambling I've been doing with you, but just typed out, and it's easier to take a break when they feel like it. I am on Blue Sky at mycomicrelief. I am on the cesspool formerly known as Twitter at my_comic_relief. I am on Instagram and Threads at consulting theologian. And then my website, as far as the, you know, how to reclaim Christianity from, you know, far right nonsense and things like that, would be michaeljmillerconsulting.com. And I think that's all of them. And this is, I hope this is a special moment, because this is the first time I've ever been able to list those all back to back without forgetting. Normally when I do something like this, I'm like sending an email or a message afterwards, like, I forgot these 7. So that's, I feel thank you for creating the space here where I could accurately recall that.
Of course. Whoever, I told you you'd hear her at some point. My goodness gracious.
Well, it's okay. She wanted to join in as well.
She needs to get her own thing. My life is devoted enough. So, wherever you're listening to this episode, look in the show notes, and you can find all of those links where you can find Michael. Thank you so much for being here. You were an absolute pleasure. You're welcome back anytime. This has been such a good, depthful conversation that just felt really needed.
Well, thank you. I had a lot of fun, and I would love to come back again sometime. This was really, really enjoyable. And like I said at the beginning, thank you for creating so intentionally right, the space to celebrate the positivity without falling into that sort of like tribalism and gatekeeping and toxicity that unfortunately the internet allows to fan. So thank you for creating such a beautiful space here.
I appreciate you saying that. So, Good God. All right. Shh. Thank you for listening to this episode of the new and improved Vigilante Vibes. Wherever you're listening to this episode, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any more of my amazing guests or any future episodes. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed and have a marvelous night.